Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Please subscribe to this channel if you believe that the greatest stories in history deserve to be told. And in the comments below, write where you are watching from, your city, your state, your country. Because what you are about to hear is not fiction. It is a true story from the summer of 1944 that will escalate with every passing minute until you cannot believe what these men were willing to risk for each other. This is a story about a single decision made in seconds that could have ended 2 lives, destroyed a fighter plane, and resulted in a court-martial. Instead, it became one of the most extraordinary rescues in the history of aerial warfare. Stay with me until the very end, because the danger does not stop until the wheels touch English soil. The sky over occupied France on the morning of August 18, 1944, was pale and hazy blue. Lieutenant Royce Priest flew in formation with his squadron, the drone of 12 Packard Merlin engines a constant roar. Below him, the fields of France spread out in patches of green and gold, dotted with villages occupied by German forces for more than 4 years. Priest was 23 years old. He had been in England for 6 months flying escort missions for the heavy bombers. He had seen men die, seen bombers explode in midair, seen fighters spiral down trailing smoke and fire. You could not think about that and still climb into your own cockpit the next morning. So you did not think. You flew. You followed orders. You came home. But today was different. Today, Priest was flying on the wing of Major Bert Marshall. Marshall was a legend in the squadron. He was 31 years old and had 5 confirmed kills. He was aggressive in the air, fearless to the point of recklessness, and he had a way of making his pilots believe they could do anything. Priest admired Marshall more than he had ever admired anyone in his life. Marshall was the kind of man you wanted to follow into combat, the kind of man you would trust with your life. They were on a fighter sweep mission, hunting for targets along the front lines. When Marshall spotted vehicle movement below, he did not hesitate. The radio crackled, Marshall's voice calm and commanding. "This is Red Leader, vehicle movement at 2 o'clock low, going down for a look. Red 2, stay with me." Priest keyed his microphone. "Red 2, roger." Marshall's Mustang peeled off and began to descend. Priest followed, the altimeter unwinding as they lost altitude. Marshall was leading them toward a dirt road where dust was rising. German trucks moving in convoy. They came in fast and low. Marshall was already lining up for his strafing run when the world exploded. The flak came from concealed positions in the fields, bright orange flashes followed by black puffs of smoke. The Germans had been waiting, their anti-aircraft batteries perfectly camouflaged. Marshall had flown straight into a trap. Priest saw the tracers arcing up, bright lines of fire. He saw Marshall's voice on the radio, urgent. "Braking left, heavy flak." But it was too late. The flak shell hit Marshall's Mustang just behind the cockpit. Priest saw the flash, the spray of debris. Marshall's aircraft lurched violently, trailing smoke. More tracers converged on the stricken fighter as pieces of metal tore away. Marshall was trying to climb, but the Mustang was mortally wounded. Black smoke poured from the engine and flames licked back along the cowling. Priest pulled hard on the stick, yanking away from the flak. The radio was chaos, pilots shouting warnings. But all Priest could see was Marshall's aircraft, spinning out of control, trailing a black plume across the sky. Marshall's voice cut through the static. "Red 2, this is Red Leader. I am bailing out. Do not attempt to follow me down. Return to base. That is an order." The canopy blew off Marshall's Mustang. A moment later, a small figure tumbled out, falling before a white parachute blossomed above him. Marshall had gotten out. He was alive, but he was descending into occupied France, and there was nothing Priest could do about it. The standing orders were clear. If a pilot went down behind enemy lines, you reported his position and returned to base. You did not land. You did not attempt a rescue. Single-seat fighters were not equipped for this. Attempting to land behind enemy lines was forbidden, absolutely forbidden, because it was suicide. But Royce Priest was not thinking about orders. He was thinking about Major Bert Marshall hanging beneath that parachute, drifting down into enemy hands. Priest keyed his microphone. "Red Leader, this is Red 2. I have visual on your position. I am going to get you." Marshall's voice, sharp with alarm. "Negative, Red 2. That is a direct order. Return to base immediately." But Priest had already pushed the stick forward, diving toward the earth. Below was a wheat field, large and open near where Marshall would land. It looked flat. It looked long enough. It would have to be enough. The squadron was shouting on the radio, demanding to know what he was doing. Priest ignored them all. He dropped his landing gear and lowered his flaps, slowing the Mustang. The field rushed up to meet him. There were ruts and furrows, uneven ground that could catch a wheel and flip the aircraft instantly. But there was no time to find a better spot. Priest brought the Mustang in as slowly as he dared, fighting the controls. The wheels touched the wheat, bounced hard, touched again. The Mustang jolted and shook, the tail wheel slamming down. Priest stood on the brakes, praying the gear would hold. The Mustang slewed to the left, the wing dipping dangerously, but the fighter straightened out, slowed, and finally shuddered to a stop. Priest threw back the canopy. Marshall was running toward him, sprinting across the field, his parachute abandoned behind him. The Major's face was streaked with oil and blood. Behind him, half a mile away, dust was rising on a road. German vehicles racing toward them. Marshall reached the aircraft and grabbed the cockpit. "Are you out of your mind?" he shouted over the engine. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" Priest began tearing at his parachute straps, ripping the buckles open, pulling the pack off. He threw it out of the cockpit, followed by his survival vest, his map case, everything not essential. He was making room. "No," Marshall said. "Absolutely not. There is not enough room. The aircraft cannot take the weight. You will never get off the ground." "Get in," Priest said, his voice calm but his hands shaking. "Get in now, sir, or I am not leaving without you." Marshall looked back. The German vehicles were closer now. There was no time to argue. Marshall cursed and climbed onto the wing, hauling himself up. Priest shoved himself as far forward as he could, and Marshall wedged himself into the tiny space behind him. It was impossible. The cockpit was designed for one man, and now there were two. Marshall's chest pressed against Priest's back, his legs jammed awkwardly. The canopy would not close. Marshall grabbed it and forced it down, latching it halfway. The weight was catastrophic. The Mustang sagged, the suspension compressing. The aircraft had not been designed for this. The manual said it was impossible. The physics said it was suicide. Priest shoved the throttle forward. The Merlin engine roared. The Mustang began to move, rolling through the wheat, picking up speed with agonizing slowness. The aircraft felt wrong, sluggish, and heavy. He pushed the throttle to the firewall. The airspeed climbed. 30 miles per hour, 40, 50. Not fast enough. They needed 90 to get airborne, and the field was running out. Ahead, the far edge approached, a line of trees. Behind them, the Germans opened fire. The crack of rifles, the thump of machine guns. Tracers zipped past the cockpit. One punched through the left wing with a metallic clang. Another hit the tail. Marshall was shouting in Priest's ear, but Priest could not hear over the engine. The airspeed climbed. 60, 70, 80. The trees rushed toward them, a solid green wall. Priest eased back on the stick. 85 miles per hour. The trees were so close he could see individual branches. And then, impossibly, the Mustang lifted. The nose came up, the wheels left the ground, and they were flying barely, skimming over the tops of the trees with inches to spare. Priest heard branches crack against the fuselage, but they were airborne, climbing, clawing for altitude with painful slowness. But the danger was not over. The engine temperature gauge was climbing, the needle already in the yellow zone and moving toward red. The Mustang was overloaded, and the engine was working harder than it had ever been designed to work. The cooling system could not keep up. Priest could feel the heat radiating from the engine, could smell overheating metal. If the engine seized, they would go down. Marshall was pressed so tightly against him that Priest could feel every breath. Neither spoke. There was nothing to say. They were flying an aircraft that should not be flying over enemy territory with a dying engine. The radio crackled. "Red 2, this is Red 5. We have you in sight. German fighters reported in your area. We are moving to intercept. Maintain your heading and stay low." Priest keyed the microphone. "Red 5, Roger. Engine is overheating. I do not know how long we can stay airborne." "Understood, Red 2. Just keep flying. We will get you home." The minutes crawled by. Priest kept the Mustang low, hugging the treetops. Every few seconds he glanced at the engine temperature gauge, watching the needle creep higher into the red zone. The engine was going to fail. It was only a question of when. They were over occupied France, maybe 60 miles from the coast. The English Channel was beyond that, another 20 miles of water. Could they make it? The numbers did not look good. Behind him, Marshall spoke, his voice calm. "You should not have done this, Lieutenant." Priest did not take his eyes off the horizon. "Yes, sir." "You disobeyed a direct order." "Yes, sir." "You risked your aircraft, your life, and the mission." "Yes, sir." There was a pause. Then Marshall said very quietly, "Thank you." Priest felt something break loose in his chest. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. They flew on. The French countryside slid by beneath them. Priest's shoulders ached from holding the aircraft steady. Sweat soaked his flight suit, and he could feel Marshall's sweat too. The engine temperature gauge was pegged at the top of the red zone now, and wisps of smoke began trailing from the cowling. The Merlin was destroying itself. It was a miracle it had not exploded already. And then ahead, Priest saw the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The coast. The thin gray line where land met sea, the boundary between occupation and freedom. The English Channel stretched beyond it, vast and blue-gray and impossibly wide. But it was there. They had made it to the coast. "Red 2, this is Red 5. You have friendly fighters at your 9 o'clock. We are escorting you across the channel. Do not deviate from your course." Priest looked left and saw them, 4 P-51 Mustangs flying in loose formation. They had come to bring him home. Relief flooded through him. He was not alone. They would make it. The Mustang crossed the coastline and flew out over the water. Priest let himself relax, just a fraction. The engine was still running, still somehow producing power, though smoke poured from the cowling now, thick and black. They were on borrowed time. But the English coast was visible ahead, a dark smudge that grew larger with every passing second. Marshall spoke again. "Where are we landing?" "Steeple Morton," Priest said. "It is the closest field." "Can we make it?" Priest looked at the engine temperature gauge, at the smoke, at the oil pressure dropping. "I do not know, sir." They made it. The Mustang crossed the English coast with the engine rattling and coughing, pieces breaking loose inside but still running, still turning the propeller, still keeping them in the air. Priest saw the airfield ahead, the runways laid out in an X, and tears came to his eyes. He radioed the tower. "Steeple Morton Tower, this is Red 2. Emergency landing. Engine failure imminent. 2 souls on board." There was a pause. Red 2, say again. Did you say 2 souls on board? Affirmative, Tower. 2 souls, requesting immediate clearance to land. Red 2, you are cleared to land any runway. Emergency crews are standing by. Priest brought the Mustang around in a wide, gentle turn, lining up with the runway. The landing gear came down with a thunk. The field was close now, the runway stretching out in front of them. Priest eased the throttle back, letting the Mustang descend. Behind him, Marshall was silent, trusting Priest to get them down. The wheels touched the concrete and the Mustang bounced once, twice, then settled. Priest let the aircraft slow on its own, not trusting the brakes. Finally, the Mustang coasted to a stop. Priest pulled the mixture to idle cutoff, and the engine died with a final rattling gasp. Silence fell, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the wail of approaching sirens. Priest sat there, unable to move. It was over. They had made it. They were alive. Marshall tried to climb out and discovered he could not move his legs. The cramped position had cut off circulation. Ground crew lifted him out and he collapsed onto the wing, unable to stand. Medics rushed forward. Priest climbed out on shaking legs and stood beside the ruined Mustang. The aircraft was a wreck. The engine was scorched and blackened, the wings riddled with bullet holes. It should never have flown, but it had. Priest looked at Marshall, who was sitting on the wing now, rubbing feeling back into his legs. Their eyes met. Marshall nodded once. Priest nodded back. The debriefing was brutal. Priest was hauled before his commanding officer within an hour. He had disobeyed direct orders. He had endangered his aircraft. He had violated standing procedures. He had taken a reckless, unauthorized risk. The commanding officer was furious, pacing, his face red with anger. Priest stood at attention and took it, offering no excuses. What could he say? He had broken the rules. He had known he was breaking them. He would do it again. The question of what to do with Lieutenant Royce Priest went all the way up the chain of command, eventually landing on the desk of Major General James Doolittle, the commanding general of the 8th Air Force. Doolittle was a legend himself, a pilot who had led the famous raid on Tokyo, and he understood the strange calculus of risk that governed aerial combat. He reviewed the case personally, reading reports, interviewing witnesses, and finally calling Priest into his office. Priest stood at attention, his cap tucked under his arm, his heart pounding. Doolittle looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "Lieutenant, do you understand how many regulations you violated?" "Yes, sir." "Do you understand that what you did was, by any reasonable standard, completely insane?" "Yes, sir." Doolittle leaned back in his chair. "Do you also understand that Major Marshall is one of the finest combat leaders in this theater, and that his experience and knowledge are worth more to this war effort than 100 fighter aircraft?" Priest blinked. "Sir." "You brought him back, Lieutenant. Against all odds, against all logic, you brought him back. And for that, you are being awarded the Distinguished Service Cross." Priest felt the words hit him like a physical blow. The Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration in the United States Army. He opened his mouth, closed it, had no idea what to say. Doolittle stood and came around the desk. "But understand this, Lieutenant. You are never to do anything like this again. What you did worked this time because you are a skilled pilot and because you got lucky. If you had crashed, if you had been captured, if you had gotten Marshall killed, I would have court-martialed you myself. The rules exist for a reason. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir, I understand." Doolittle extended his hand and Priest shook it. "Dismissed, Lieutenant, and congratulations." The story of the rescue spread through the 8th Air Force like wildfire. Pilots talked about it everywhere. Lieutenant Royce Priest, who had landed behind enemy lines to save his squadron commander. The man who had crammed 2 people into a single-seat fighter and flown it home on an overheating engine. It became a legend, the kind of story that inspired other men to take risks. Some of those risks paid off, others did not. More than one pilot tried to replicate Priest's feat in the months that followed, and some died in the attempt. The reality was that what Priest had done was not a blueprint. It was a miracle, a 1 in a million chance. But it was also something more. It was a statement about what men would do for each other in war, about the bonds that formed between pilots who flew together, fought together, died together. It was a reminder that in the middle of all the death and destruction, there were still moments of extraordinary courage and selflessness. There were still men who would risk everything to save a friend. Royce Priest and Bert Marshall both survived the war. They flew more missions, saw more combat, lost more friends. They carried the memories of that day for the rest of their lives, the feeling of being crammed into that cockpit, the sound of the engine dying, the relief of touching down on English soil. They stayed in touch after the war, visiting each other, calling on birthdays and holidays. The war had bound them together in a way that nothing else could. Marshall never forgot what Priest had done. In interviews years later, he would say that he owed his life to a young lieutenant who had made a split-second decision to disobey orders and land in a wheat field in occupied France. He would say that Priest was the bravest man he had ever known. Priest, for his part, never saw himself as a hero. He would say that he had simply done what any pilot would do for his squadron commander, for his friend. He would say that the real heroes were the men who did not come home. He would say that he had just been lucky. But luck was only part of it. What Royce Priest did on August 18, 1944, required more than luck. It required skill, courage, and a willingness to gamble everything on a single desperate throw of the dice. It required the ability to look at an impossible situation and decide that impossible was not the same as undoable. It required moral clarity that comes only in moments of extreme crisis, when there is no time to think, only time to act. The wheat field where Priest landed that day is still there, somewhere in France. The exact location has been lost to time, but the story remains, passed down through the generations, a reminder of what men are capable of when everything is on the line. It is a story about friendship and sacrifice, about courage and desperation, about a single moment when one man decided that he would rather die trying to save his friend than live knowing he had left him behind. And it is a story that asks a question. What would you have done? If you had been in that cockpit, if you had seen your commander shot down, if you had heard the order to return to base, what would you have done? Would you have followed the rules, the procedures, the logic that said attempting a rescue was suicide? Or would you have pushed the stick forward, dropped your landing gear, and taken the chance? There is no right answer. War forces men to make impossible choices, to weigh their own survival against the lives of others. Royce Priest made his choice in the space of a few heartbeats, and he lived with the consequences for the rest of his life. He saved a man's life, and in doing so, he became part of history. The real lesson is not about heroism or medals or glory. The real lesson is about what it means to be human, to care about another person so much that you are willing to risk everything to save them. It is about the connections we forge in the darkest moments of our lives, and the lengths we will go to honor those connections. It is about the fact that sometimes the right thing to do is also the most dangerous thing, and that doing it anyway is what separates ordinary men from extraordinary ones. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you that real history is more powerful than any fiction, then please hit the like button below. Subscribe to this channel if you believe these stories deserve to be preserved and told to future generations. And here is my question for you. If you had been Lieutenant Royce Priest on that day in August 1944, would you have landed in that wheat field? Would you have disobeyed orders to save a friend? Write your answer in the comments below and tell me where you are watching from, your city, your state, your country. Because this is not just a story from the past. This is a question about who we are, about what we value, about what we are willing to sacrifice for the people we care about. And that question will never stop being relevant, no matter how much time passes.